Okay, good morning, everyone. We're going to try it this way, old school, okay? I'm sorry that I don't have any beautiful pictures to show you, or I don't even have a dry erase board to write on, so you're going to have to use your imagination maybe a little bit this morning. But today, of course, we're supposed to be examining the parable of the tares and the wheat, sometimes called the parable of the weeds and the wheat. And I am going to admit right up front that this is one that I have always personally struggled with a little bit to understand. And I was first really exposed to this parable, interestingly, not in my Christian journey, but in my academic journey. It was because I was in graduate school and we were having to read through some of the fathers of the church. And I remember this particular parable being one that is found in the commentaries of, for instance, St. Augustine, St. Jerome, St. John Chrysostom. They all wrote, and several others, all wrote about this particular parable. And interestingly, the time they're writing, remember, third and fourth century of the church, they took this parable to mean, it was a parable about the church. It was a parable about the heresies and the half-truths and the lies that had been introduced into early Christianity, so that the tares, the weeds, were heresies, and the wheat was the good seed sown in the church when Christ established the church. So, but as sort of you go through this parable and you begin to, like we inevitably do with all of them, we want to know how to apply them to our own lives, then you begin to see it as something perhaps more than just the church. Maybe it's that as well. Maybe it's the whole world. Maybe it's the church, and maybe it's my individual life, the field of my life. And so I wanted to look at it from all those different perspectives, and I had some beautiful artwork to show you and some very clever things to show you, and this is why the devil is in the business this morning of messing this up, right? So, let's start. He proposed another parable to them. The kingdom of heaven may be likened to a man who sowed good seed in his field. While everyone was asleep, his enemy came and sowed weeds all through the wheat, and then went off. When the crop grew and bore fruit, the weeds appeared as well. The slaves of the householder came to him and said, "Master, did you not sow good seed in your field? Where have the weeds come from?" He answered, "An enemy has done this." His slave said to him, "Do you want us to go and pull them up?" He replied, "No. If you pull up the weeds, you might uproot the wheat along with them. Let them grow together until harvest. Then at harvest time, I will say to the harvesters, first collect the weeds and tie them in bundles for burning, but gather the wheat into my barn." So, the kingdom of heaven is like, or likened. This Sunday's parable tells us immediately, after the parable of the sower that we heard last week. Remember, we're going right into this one. This is another one where the disciples go to Jesus immediately afterwards and say, "Can you please explain that to us?" So the explanation follows in the verses that follow that. And Sunday, let's talk about last Sunday. Remember how we discussed the sower, the generosity of the sower? Do y'all remember this? It's kind of a test. Is that he sows everywhere. He sows indiscriminately, even in places where seed isn't likely to grow at all. So I think it's important we go back and make that point before we look a little more at this parable. Because the sower knows nothing but generosity. Nothing but generosity. Nothing but a lack of discrimination. Because you see, the sower sees only possibility and promise. The sower. Right? I'm a sower. You're a sower. But the sower sees only possibility and promise, even in the most unlikely places. Remember, rocky soil, thorny soil, God just tosses seed there too, because God sees possibility. Where we see what? Impossibility. We see impossibility where God sees possibility. So it's important, I think, we review that idea that Jesus is the sower. So here we're talking about another field. This field described in the parable today, Jesus describes the sabotaging of a field by planting tares, weeds. Darnel is actually probably what it is, a poisonous plant that looks very much like wheat until it matures. And when it matures, when the bud, the head of the wheat comes out, it becomes obvious that what is growing next to it, if it's a tare, if it's a darnel, is not wheat. It looks similar until it matures. So isn't that already an interesting parallel to consider? It's a poisonous plant. And it looks like wheat while it's very young, while it's growing. And apparently this is not just a metaphor, y'all. It's not just a metaphor. Do you know that there were Roman laws on the books that prohibited people from planting in other people's fields? Even if it was generally considered to be a common land, once that field had been planted, it was against the law to go in and plant alongside someone else. So this is not just a metaphor that Jesus is using. It's probably it's a story that would have resonated with people, like all of his agricultural parables do. There's a resonance there among the people. But what happens is when you attempt to pull out the weed, the foreign plant that someone else may have planted, then you run the risk of losing the wheat. You run the risk of losing the harvest, what you had originally planted there. The wheat, which is the goal, right? The end product. Wheat, what really feeds the world, does it not? This parable is unique to Matthew, by the way, with no clear parallel occurring elsewhere in the other Gospels, unlike some of the other ones we're going to be talking about. In fact, before we go much further, can we do something? Can we talk about wheat? Can we talk about wheat? I had something beautiful I was going to show you. So imagine this wheat blowing in the wind, right? Beautiful, beautiful wheat blowing in the wind, like tall amber waves of grain. Yes. Okay. Imagine that. Today, think about this. I mean, this is important to realize that when we're talking about wheat, there's so much richness there that we can explore spiritually. Today, the world produces 800 million tons of wheat to feed the world. Literally to feed the world. Feeds billions of people. In some places in the world, it is the major source of food. And the story of wheat, I mean, it was a staple, if you think about it, like if this were a Western civilization class, we'd be talking about this. The staple of this in the diet goes back thousands of years. Thousands of years. I mean, to the Neolithic age. And I've always wondered about this. How did man first learn that if you took this particular seed, the cap of a wheat plant, and you ground it down with stone, that you would get something that you could then use to eat? It's really remarkable that it even happened. Long before there's a written language. Let's go back, ancient Mesopotamia, and let's go back maybe 6,000 years. Long before there's really even a written language, Neolithic man, they discovered they could grind grains of wheat to make a very fine flour, and then that fine flour becomes hugely important in the whole history of man. This is hugely important, I would say arguably a major turning point in the history of civilization, not to put too fine a point on it. Because you see, first, man was a hunter-gatherer. Early man was a hunter-gatherer. We hunted, right? We gathered the food that we could, that was growing where we might happen to be. But generally, man chased the herds. Man was nomadic. Man went wherever the food supply was, that's where man went. Traveled. Then, the next shift in civilization occurs when man becomes agricultural. And why is that important? Because now man has to stay in one place to see through the season. Well, now that you're living in one place, you begin to settle into communities. This is when civilization develops. You begin to settle into communities. Now you must have things like laws to govern. You have to have systems, even simple ones. But you have to have systems of some sort of governance, some rule of law, some order. So man begins to grow in civilization. Alongside what? The major staple crop for the ancient world, which was wheat. So our story really runs in parallel with this incredibly important product. Agriculture requires us to stay put. And there's all sorts of things we could explore about that too, right? Staying put. The Egyptians made this particularly more scientific, really. You have to give credit to them for a lot, but particularly beginning about 3000 BC, they are the ones who sort of are the first to have the idea that this could be baked into something. Bread, right? Thank you. Thank you, ancient Egyptians, for this. We have bread. Bake it into bread. Remember, this is why, I'm sorry not to go on too much of a rabbit trail, but remember that this is why cats were sacred in ancient Egypt. It's because cats guarded the granary. Cats kept the rats out of the grain, so there was wheat, there was bread, there was a food supply. It's why it's a capital offense to harm a cat. Now, I'm not going to go into that. If you don't like cats, I'm sorry, but that's the truth. It's a capital offense in ancient Egypt to harm a cat. Today, our milling process is obviously so much more sophisticated, and we produce enough wheat to feed a global community. A little wheat actually goes a long way. There's another rich metaphor in that too. It doesn't take very much. 1 acre of wheat will yield approximately 40 bushels, and 1 bushel of wheat can produce hundreds of loaves of bread. So we're talking about a lot of potential, aren't we? Just in a wheat field. A whole lot of potential. Now, this might not make, what I just told you is not going to make the Food Channel. It's probably not going to make the History Channel either, but it is clearly important. So by the time that Jesus is telling this parable, wheat is known as a staple of everyone's diet. When he's talking about wheat, bread is a daily meal. Think about even, of course, all the rich Eucharistic symbolism there is in this. That one of the 7 petitions of the Lord's Prayer is, give us this day our daily bread. And we're not just talking about the food we need to eat for our bodies, we're talking about the spiritual food that is the Eucharist. It is from wheat that we have what comes to us under the form of bread, initially under the form of bread, which is Christ's own body that is then given to us, right? So there's all this rich stuff that we could talk about. But I want to get back to the parable. Okay, so the parable of the sower we talked about last week. Remember, let's go back to that again. He always sows good seed. The sower. So in the parable that we're hearing now, where do the tares, where do the weeds come from? If the sower goes out and sows good seed in the field, that is the wheat, where do the tares, where do the weeds come from? Says the enemy. Says the enemy. The enemy comes in, what? While everyone is sleeping, and sows the weeds. Now this is where I've always struggled with this a little bit. I mentioned to you that a lot of the problem is that what I've read about this has been informed by what the early fathers looked at in relationship to specific heresies in the early church. So, do you think, when you think about wheat and weeds, and you get this parable in your mind as Jesus is telling us that the field has been sown with wheat, which is the world, and then someone comes in under the cover of darkness while everyone is sleeping and sows the weeds, do you think about wheat and weeds as people? Can the enemy sow souls, sow people? I got you thinking? About this? Good. Good. So the weeds, the tares, are we talking about people among us? Are we talking about sin and influence among us? Okay, so hold that thought, because this is the part of this that's I've always tried to explore a little bit in my own life. We know that the sower can only sow good seed, and the devil sows the tares. The good and the bad seed then grow up together until the end of the world, when judgment will separate the weeds from the wheat, right? That's the harvest. The wheat is to be harvested into the barn, and the weeds, the tares, will be bound up and burned. It's what the parable says. So at this point, I would have you looking at a section from St. Augustine's sermon, number 23. You can go look it up. It's not here. But sermon number 23, St. Augustine writes this. This was a reading for his community, apparently, on the day, or perhaps surrounding a reading of the parables. He says this: "Today the Lord has again spoken another parable of the sower, who sowed good seed in his field. While men slept, the enemy came and sowed tares upon it. As long as it was only in the blade," in other words, before it's mature, "as long as it was only in the blade, it did not appear. But as soon as the fruit of the good seed began to appear, then appeared the tares also." So this is what St. Augustine goes on to say. When good fruit appears, so does the enemy. When you are producing, the enemy will show up right there alongside you. Because the enemy comes for anything that is good. So, to paraphrase him, if the enemy goes after anything that is good, and as this parable illustrates rather perfectly, it often does it very insidiously, doesn't it? Quietly even. Unobtrusively. And maybe sort of shows up at a time that you don't even expect to see it. Quietly, unobtrusively, insidiously, until it's time for the fruit to appear and it reveals itself for what it is. Now, if you looked up, I'm interested in this, I like word history. So if you looked up like what the definition of the word tare is, T-A-R-E, it's got a lot of different dictionary definitions, which I also find very interesting. It can be a vetch, a weed, something that is actually also a weight of measure. Now, y'all, this is interesting. How many of y'all still with me? All the tables still with me? See, I feel like because I don't have anything for you to look at, you're not with me. All right. So you can tell I teach 18-year-old college students who have a attention span of about 3.8 seconds. So a tare is also a unit of measure. Except it's a measure of something when it is empty. Like if you wanted to measure a container, the tare measurement is what it weighs when it's empty, not when it's full. Isn't that interesting?
Oh, they measure semis.
Yeah, exactly. Trucks. Anything that would be empty, you can weigh it, and that's measured in tares. Okay? The measure of something that is a void. It's a void of something. It's empty of something. So isn't that fascinating? I love that. I don't know that it has anything to do with the parable, that Jesus had that in mind, or that anybody had that in mind, but I did find that interesting, that it is a measure of something that is empty. Another way to think of it is a deduction from the total of something. Allowing for whatever is not going to be. That's also another way to think about it. The biblical definition, though, is really what we're talking about is a form of ryegrass that is darnel, as I mentioned. The difference is you only discover that when it grows, when the ear appears, you know that it is a weed and not the wheat. So when we first hear this imagery, we might wonder to ourselves, or I certainly have, how on earth would the workers struggle to differentiate between the wheat and the weeds? Shouldn't that be obvious? Well, it is, especially to us if we grew up in the Western Hemisphere. Weeds look like spiky green plants, and wheat is a golden brown long plant. So we might not struggle to see the difference. But in the Middle Eastern climate, tares look near identical to wheat until the harvest. Also, interestingly, tares do not appear, weeds like this, do not appear in fallow fields. Do you know what I mean by that? So a field, for instance, that has been perhaps, it's overproduced. The nutrients have not been put back in, sorry about that. The nutrients have not been put back into the soil. You've stripped all the nutrients out. The field is now fallow. Nothing will grow there, including the weeds. So tares don't grow in fallow fields either. Only among good wheat. And as a matter of fact, another thing that's really interesting about this is that tares, this kind of tare, this darnel that we're talking about, actually needs good wheat. to grow alongside or among. Do you know why? Because the wheat actually provides the nutrients in the soil that tare lives upon. Isn't that interesting? Y'all are learning so much about agriculture of the ancient Middle East. It actually provides, the wheat is what provides the nutrients, the rich nutrients in the soil that the tare lives off parasitically. Okay, that might be great for the tare, but how does that sound for the wheat? What's happening to the wheat in the meantime while the tare is sucking out all the nutrients? Yeah, there's the danger that the wheat can get choked out. Exactly. So there's so much rich stuff in this. A lot of biblical scholars assert that the tare that Jesus describes is a very specific plant. If you wanted to go look it up, it's called timulentium. I can spell it for you. It's T-E-M-U-L-E-N-T-U-M. Timulentium. I how to say that. Timulentium. Anyway, for those of you that are botanists or amateur botanists, there you go. And those parts where the grain is headed out, this particular plant has done the same. It actually happens at the same time, almost at the exact same time. So when both of them are growing together, the tare depends upon the wheat. The wheat can grow without the tare and actually thrives without the tare. So there's another sort of point to make about that. This particular grain, by the way, I also found this to be rather interesting in my botanical exploration of this parable. This particular grain is what causes ergotism. Ergotism, E-R-G-O-T-I-S-M. When it ferments, it introduces this, it's a poison, and you can have convulsions and die from it. Just like the weeds, I guess, in the field of your life can produce a kind of spiritual death. So this is not, let's be honest, this is by no means, it's probably a very well-known parable, but I dare say this is not one of Jesus' most popular parables, because the parable of the wheat and the tares, the weeds, has been a somewhat, when you think about it, it has kind of a harrowing tone to it, doesn't it? How does it end? It ends with the wheat being harvested for the barn and the tares being burned up. There's an enemy afoot. And this is when I wish you could see the enemy I had to show you. This is so cool. I found the coolest slide. I'm going to have to send this to everybody because you're going to have to look at it. So there's an enemy afoot in the field at night. Sneaks in, sows weeds, and no one notices. No one notices. We see both justice and compassion in this parable, do we not? Think about it. Justice and compassion. How do we see justice? The justice is that at the last day, the harvest, the wheat is separated and brought into the barn, into the kingdom of heaven. That's justice, I suppose. The weeds, well, we might say that's justice too. The weeds get burned. But also consider the compassion inherent in the parable, that they are allowed to grow together for a time. Think about that for a moment. How they're allowed to grow together for a time. So, what might it mean for the tare to grow alongside the wheat? Let's say that you're one of when I asked this question earlier, you're one of these people that said, oh, the tares are people. Or the tares could be people who are perhaps corrupted by sin, or who have given in to sin, who are under the influence of sin. What influence might the wheat have on a tare like that? If you grow alongside each other for a season, a lifetime, what influence does the wheat have on the tare? Don't we have to believe that? Don't we have to believe that? Anybody here feel like they're a stalk of wheat today? We're never supposed to presume, by the way. I'm a stalk of wheat. We're not supposed to presume this, but don't you think that there is something beneficial, potentially? Potentially. Remember that God sees possibility and promise where we see impossibility. So isn't it possible, if it's not likely, is it not possible that the tare growing alongside the wheat might be influenced by the wheat? Conversion. A conversion. Yeah. Now, it's also that when I say compassion and allowing them to grow alongside each other, let's look at it from the other perspective. Okay, so you're the stalk of wheat and you've got this tare in your life. Okay? Or you're living among tares, or there's a group of them. Right? Remember, this cuts through your own soul as well, though, too. Let's don't ever lose sight of that. This cuts through our own souls. Sin cuts through everybody's soul. So we can't really presume that. But let's just imagine for a moment, you see yourself as a stalk of wheat and you have this tare growing alongside you. How might that benefit you? How do you become a stronger stalk of wheat? Even though you've got somebody sucking the nutrients out of your soil. How do you become a stronger stalk of wheat? Is you have to reach, don't you? You have to really reach. And maybe not just down deep, right, to strengthen your roots, but you have to reach higher too. And if you use that imagery we've used of the field, then remember that a stalk of wheat has a root system in the soil, yes, beneath the earth, but also reaches its head toward the heights. So I think that's another useful metaphor to use, is that in order for the wheat to become stronger, sometimes the tare against it serves as the source of that. I mean, not the source. Scratch that, not the source, but serves as an impetus for the wheat to become stronger. Yeah? So, again, not to get too much into the weeds, unintended. I'm not a farmer, so I am going to hesitate to draw too much from the metaphor. But even my very limited experience with, we talked about this last week, with sowing flowers, like throwing wildflower seeds. Even my very limited experience with that has shown me how often it is difficult to tell for sure what is the weed and what is not, especially for somebody like me who stops on roadsides to pick weeds. Or what other people would call weeds that are flowers, right? Not flowers. What some people call weeds, and mow them down during mowing season. I promise you there's a special place in hell for those people. Until the kingdom of God, though, I mean, we really, we're told the bad and the good will grow together. Will grow together. And may be difficult to distinguish. Do we like this? No. It's distressing, I think, for all of us to live in a world where we can't distinguish sometimes. Wouldn't life be easier if the lines were just more clearly drawn? Because of course, Jesus isn't just speaking about wheat fields, is he? He's talking about our work in the world, our growth in the field, where the lines are blurred, even in our own souls. Those lines are blurred. And let's never lose sight of this. This parable reminds us that only God knows what he is doing when it comes to sifting out the wheat from the tares. Only he knows our hearts, every human heart. Only he can know the state of someone's soul. So when we want to throw shade on somebody, or classify someone as bad, or classify someone as good, or falsely give ourselves maybe the role of the wheat, it's not our prerogative to do that. That is only God's, to judge hearts and decide who is worthy of our time, our love, our mercy. Remember that, again, tares grow alongside the wheat. So last week, when we talked about Jesus as the sower, this is another question that comes to my mind. If he sows the good seed, why does he allow the enemy to come in and sow the impostor's poisonous seed at all? Why does he allow that? Okay. Man made a choice long time ago Man made a choice. Yes, it is free will. I mean, that's a metaphor for a lot of things. Why then would Jesus allow the tares to mature? Not because the tares are going to stop being tares, or are they? You see, I think the same promise and possibility we read into the parable of the sower last week, we have to see here too. There's possibility and there's promise among the wheat. Among the wheat.
Well, if they look the same when they start growing,
Right.
when would you cut
When
out
would you
the
know?
tares?
When would you know? And by the time you do know, it's too late to remove it without damaging the wheat. Now, I challenge you to think about this parable as the church. We're going to look at it a couple of different ways. But, you know, my question inevitably is, okay, all this is great. Thank you, St. Jerome. Thank you, St. John Chrysostom. Thank you, St. Augustine. I want to know what it means in the field of my life, right? But so I want to do this a couple of different ways. But let's think of it as they did, as a parable of the church. How often do we hear people who are critical of the human reality of the church? How often do we hear this? The seeming weaknesses or failures of the church, and people are very quick to point them out. Well, that person's a heretic, right? That person's not living the faith correctly. You can insert whatever in the blank you want to. And I'm not trying to make people uncomfortable. I'm telling you what St. Jerome said, which, of course, he wasn't the kindest. Anyway, but I've said this many times. He would not be a saint today. But how many times do we find ourselves critical of other people in the church? We wish they would do this. They wish they would do that. We wish they wouldn't do this, or wouldn't do that, or wouldn't say that. The Pilgrim Church, people, is the field of tares and wheat. It is. Jesus the sower established the church. He sowed the good seed to carry it forward. But the Pilgrim Church is also a human institution in time and in space and on earth. And who is the ruler of this world? The enemy who sows seed wherever he can. And is there more fertile ground for him to sow seed than in the field of the church? This is a human reality. There's a human reality to the church. Fallible people in an infallible, eternal church that is transcendent. The church is in history, but it is also outside of time and space. It is transcendent and eternal, and that is where the church is perfect. The church triumphant. Not here. The earliest Christians that I referenced, they all wrestled with this reality of the church. St. Augustine was confronted with a group, for instance, known as the Donatists. Donatism is a heresy. Donatism claimed that for instance, the only valid priests and the only valid sacraments were let me back up. The only valid priests were those who had never renounced the faith and had never done anything against the faith and had never done anything immoral. So that the validity of the sacraments were related to the moral conduct of the priest. Okay? And then the early church wrestled with this heresy. You remember, going back to the parable of the tares and the wheat. The only valid priests were those who had never rejected or renounced the faith, which rules out our first pope, by the way, St. Peter, who denied Christ 3 times. Never in word, never in action, that this person would have never denied Christ in any way, never by some human stumbling, fallen into sin. He'd never misspoken. He'd never overreached out of charity or lack of charity. These people see a very strict and rigid interpretation of error. Based on whose standard, by the way? This is always very interesting. The people who are doing the judging have the most rigid standard, but where are they drawing the standard from to judge someone else? Their own behavior. There's usually something, this is Psychology 101, there's something in you that you are reacting to when you want to point it out at another person. This is almost universally true. So the Donatists said that these priests who had either renounced the church or stepped away from the church during times of persecution, that none of their sacraments were valid. Okay? St. Augustine knew that that wasn't possible because there's a higher reality. While he believed in the efficacy of the sacraments as much as anybody to sanctify us, he knew from personal experience, have you ever read Confessions? He knew from personal experience, and he put it this way, quote, sin is lurking at the door of every heart, end quote. No matter how hard we try to master it, no matter how much we do when we want to do right, we often find ourselves doing that which we know is not right. As St. Paul writes about in Romans. So to great effect, St. Augustine was able to employ this parable of the tares and the wheat to combat the error of the Donatists in the early church. It's used to combat heresy. This parable teaches us that we're going to struggle with sin and sinners right beside us in the field, in the church. We will not be rid of either in this life. Either in this life. Although we'd like a field of pure wheat, wouldn't you? You think we would. I wonder if we would be less interesting if we didn't have tares among us. But yeah, we all would like this field of pure wheat, but we're going to have to continue to live with a field that has been corrupted by weeds. One that someone has come in under the cover of darkness to infest. We have to live with that. So, this is why the church, the pilgrim church, the church in this life, is imperfect. It is human. Christ established the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church that also exists outside of time, where everything is already perfected, where the wheat has already been gathered into the barn. But for now, the church often finds itself divided. Does it not? Maybe we could say less holy, less Catholic, less apostolic sometimes, or it feels that way to us. But that doesn't mean that the church we have today is not the same church founded by Christ. What it means is that the church is still on the way and obtaining its ultimate purification during the harvest time too. So, what I like to do with all of Jesus' parables is ask, so what? Well, not so what, but so what does this mean for me? What does this mean in the field of my own life? What does this have to do with my everyday life? This parable is almost always used, as you've seen, to show us a big picture of eternity and salvation, as I've just outlined. It's how St. Augustine interpreted it before he invoked its understanding against the Donatist heresy. Think big, yes, but this is Jesus speaking, so remember that he's speaking to us individually too. So there's a macro meaning. There's the macro, and then there's the micro meaning that applies to our day-to-day experience. Now, instead of the field being the world or being the church, now think of the field as being your own life. Have you ever felt your life was a mix of good and evil forces with each other? You ever felt like that? Have you ever spent any time at all trying to sort through in your day what those things were? This can make us anxious to know, right, that there are tares growing around us. This is a recent realization I've had, actually, and as God usually does with perfect timing, this lesson came in time for me to share it with other people. Think about the lesson from the parable. Why be anxious? Why be anxious? Why be anxious against the tare? And I'm going to tell you, this is a personal anecdote, but it's not intended to be oversharing. I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to get too personal. But I will tell you that there are things in your life, and I guarantee you they're for you too, that are meant to stop you in your tracks, especially when you're doing something good, right? Have you ever had this experience? This morning I couldn't get the devil is in the technology this morning. But have you ever had that experience? And something will happen that will stop you or slow you down, and you're detracted or distracted from the work that was before you that was really, really, really good. And because something happens, and sometimes it's painful, sometimes it's something hurtful, and what do you want to do? You're fearful about going back to that thing. After so many associations of something negative with the good, what do you begin to do? You begin to avoid the good. Because you think, that's going to hurt again. I'm going to get slapped in the face again if I do that. Well, guess who wins? So I've had this realization that fear of something bad happening again because I'm doing something good, that is not going to be an excuse for me. That is not going to be an excuse for me. Why be anxious? Jesus has dominion over all. And first of all, the field of your own life. Know that it is not Christ who plants the tares. And here I had some beautiful art by Tim Gilliard, but anyway, you can go look it up. Christ does not sow does not sow the evil in your life to test you. He does not send evil to make you anxious or worried or afraid. He doesn't want you to suffer from the evil actions of other people. Division, discord, unity. Division, discord, disunity. Look at the dis. Dissonance. Discord, division, disunity. Sabotage of anything good only has one source. One source. And it comes, as the parable says, when we are asleep. When we are spiritually asleep. So, what are the seeds of this kind of evil? I mean, we could think about the 7 deadly sins, for instance. That's a good place to start. Envy, greed, lust, gluttony. Be alert to them, remember, and don't fall asleep spiritually. And you have to be alert to all of those things. They're deadly because they grow along the wheat. Alongside the wheat. They plant themselves. Have you ever entered into anything, and let's say that you've got some initiative, some project, something that you were working on. Have you ever entered into it, and when it begins to come to maturity, that's when the thing shows itself to distract you? Yeah? A true motive might appear, or something that's hurtful, that distracts you, and maybe that doesn't get finished. Maybe that fruit is damaged because of the influence of the weed. So, maybe it's just born of the human condition. It's sin. Even under the influence or distraction of these kind of tares, good seed only produces good fruit. So remember that. We're not talking about God has sown in you that is good. It's going to come to fruition when we don't fall spiritually asleep. So my second thought about this, anything that Christ plants in the field of your life is good. If it is of Christ, it is good. And you nurture it and it's going to produce good fruit. He only plants wheat. So the other thing is that I would say about this is that, and I do feel like I have to stress this again, Jesus isn't testing anybody with evil. I worry that that's what this sounds like, and I'm not saying that. He doesn't test us. He doesn't send evil to test us. He plants and sows only good. He isn't challenging you with lies or deceit. The father and author of all lies is Satan. The planter of all the tares is Satan. None of us, as wheat, will perish. So then you could think, well, I'm not always the best wheat I could be. I just shared with you. I've had this experience. I mean, I've come to a realization in my own life. We're not always the best wheat we can be, are we? Because what happens? Maybe we get afraid. Maybe something happens that takes our heart and our attention away. So maybe we're not always the best wheat we could be. But aren't you still wheat? Can't wheat get bruised and muddy and dirty and it's still wheat when it's harvested? And I also want to point this out. The master in the parable had a motive of saving the wheat, or allowing the weeds to grow along with the wheat. He knew what was best for the wheat. And the master doesn't get over preoccupied with the tares, and neither should we. We have to realize they are there. He didn't fret about them. He didn't try to separate them. He knew that he would deal with them in the appropriate way at the right time, and he was at peace about this, and so should we be. God gives us the recognition of evil. He has dominion over it, and when we renounce it, we have peace and that awareness too. So maybe another point is that, to recognize that it's about spiritual warfare, and to ask for spiritual help. Spiritual help. Who comes to do the harvest, by the way? You read the rest of the parable as Jesus explains it to his disciples when they come to say, Master, we don't understand this, explain this. Who does the harvest? Who's the harvesting agent? The angels. The angel of the harvest comes. So when we think about like spiritual warfare, ask the angels to help you. We believe there's a spiritual realm. We believe in things that are visible and invisible. There's an invisible reality that is present to help us. So I think that's another thing that I personally took away from that. Ask God to send specific angels, the specific ideas or inspirations that you need to solve whatever it is in your heart. The spiritual forces are better at this than you are. Okay? Ask your guardian angel. That's the first thing I say when my feet hit the floor in the morning, people, is my guardian angel prayer and the St. Michael the Archangel prayer. It's the first thing I say when my feet hit the floor. And then as many times during the day as I need to, right? Ask your guardian angel to help you. Another very interesting point that St. Jerome made is that the tares are harvested first. And did you notice this in the story? The tares are harvested first. St. Jerome asked this question, why is this important? Why does that matter? That the tares are taken first. That is a good question, isn't it? Sometimes it seems like the bad stuff in your life and the world is getting all the attention. Now here you are, imagine yourself as the wheat in this parable. Here you are, the wheat, and the bad stuff is getting noticed first. Even at harvest time. This process, St. Jerome says, of removing the tares can jostle the wheat. Right? Shakes up the wheat. Might damage the wheat. But mature wheat doesn't have to worry about that, he says, because the removal of the lies and the evil can be challenging, but the harvester knows what he's doing. So look at the conclusion of the parable. As soon as the tares are harvested, they're bound together and thrown into the fire. Did you hear that? They're bound together. Why is that important?
So they're going to escape back.
They don't escape, right? No. They're bound together. And if you think about the imagery of this, and again, I am drawing primarily upon St. Jerome's commentary for this because I wouldn't have been this inspired, but when they're bound together, that's a whole bunch of evil bound together. And it can have the appearance at first of being overwhelming. Strength in numbers, right? Strength in unity. So St. Jerome points this out. Doesn't that sometimes seem like that evil is united against you? You ever feel like that? If you do, he says, that signals their imminent destruction. He uses this parable to explain that the evil might bind together, and that's the moment of their destruction. When those things come to bear on you that seem overwhelming. The harvester, he says, is getting ready to destroy them. Take that as a promise, he says. When the forces of evil seem united, it's a foreshadowing of their end. Take heart. Although it certainly might not feel like it, does it? Don't be too impressed when evil makes a lot of noise, I guess would be another way to say that. Don't be too impressed. The tares, the lies, the suffering, whatever gets burned. The wheat, you, will get gathered into the barn, which is the kingdom of heaven. And obviously, I think there's a lot we can take away from this parable. A lot of other things, as I mentioned at the beginning. so many other rich narratives in here that we could tease out just a couple of words and spend an entire hour exploring. But the teaching is universal. It's macro, big level, kingdom of heaven. It's micro, the field of your life. It's corporate and it's personal. It's one of the reasons why, going back to that petition from the Lord's Prayer, give us this day our daily bread, resonated with these hearers the way it did, because our daily bread is the wheat we live on, the food for eternal life, the good grain of the field. It's all these different things. And finally, I think that we have to remember something else. I want to leave you with this thought. Must we stand against evil? Must we? Yes. Evil must be fought. Yes. But don't you think the how of the fight might matter a little bit? Maybe the how determines a good bit, actually. We are incapable of doing good on our own without spiritual help, without spiritual food. We are incapable of doing good. For instance, let's think about violence. By violence, and I mean any kind of violence. If it doesn't have to be physical or murderous kind of violence, but the violence of an ill-spoken word or something unkind. Right? Violence, remember, murder is not just killing someone else. This kind of violence can be something as simple as being unkind, a lack of charity. So that kind of violence, when I say violence that way, that does a great deal of harm. If you're going to fight evil, right, maybe let God take care of the tares. But you can identify them. You can renounce them even in your own life. But you don't have to strike out or seek to pull it out by the root. Because that's another point of the parable, isn't it? God is the sower, and he is also the God of the harvest. So we don't presume. And in the process, let's just all try to be a little kinder to each other. And this is something that I have, and I really, Father Ampat's here, and he can preach far better than I can, so this is not my job to do this. But in this particular season especially, I think it's important for us to remember to just be kind to each other. Just be kind. Yeah? So I think that's another message of the parable, is that we remember that God, we don't presume. We don't presume to know that we're the wheat. And we trust God will take care of the tares at the harvest time. Okay, I'm going to stop the recording. Anybody have any comments, questions?